Chapter 9. "So what kind of training did you have in mind, Mr. Dixon?" Quint asked as they walked out to the barn. The day before had been extraordinary, coming to the Dixon residence and seeing the dugout. Even with the potential concerns, his inward enthusiasm had rivaled even Isabella's outward expressions. He had wanted to bring her with him today, but she was at her apartment working on homework for online classes. The excitement of the past 2 days had caused her to get behind, and he wasn't about to stand in the way of her academic success. But today he wanted to see more about what this whole setup was going to become, and the part he would play in it. He also wanted to make sure the environment was safe for his bride-to-be before she came back a second time. The hooded individual with the rather rude, tough personality was his chief worry. Fortunately, he felt that Atlas Dixon had things well in hand. "Oh, please, call me Atlas," the man laughed. "Mr. Dixon is just too formal for me. I'd even prefer it if you use my last name like they do at the precinct." "All right. Atlas it is then," Quint grinned. "And that's a pretty cool name if I do say so myself." "You certainly may, Quint," Atlas replied. "But back to your question about training. I was thinking about that myself for several years. You met Kay yesterday, didn't you?" Quint's eyebrows raised. "Yes, sir, I did, and he's very intense." Atlas smiled, but it was a bit of a wary smile. "Yes, he is. Still, he's one of us. And that kind of intensity might be just the thing we need to hone our powers in a safe environment where we don't run the risk of hurting anyone." The two of them reached the barn and opened the trap door, descending into the dugout tunnels. Quint hadn't stuck around for very long yesterday after that Jasmine girl had taken off. He and Isabella had gone to Isabella's apartment for dinner, so he was interested to see what Jason and Kay had done with the place after he and Isabella had left. As they made their way to the training room, Atlas explained to Quint that in Kay, he'd found a man who was more in tune with his powers than anyone else he'd ever seen. Kay had apparently forged himself into a living weapon, along with many other possible tricks of the trade that his Shatterpoint vision made available to him. Atlas had brought him in to be the resident expert in exploring the limits of people's powers, and helping teach them to control these wild and sometimes dangerous abilities. "You really think he can teach us to control these powers?" Quint asked. Atlas gave a hesitant half nod. "I think he can help us, and that we can all learn to do it if we work together," he replied. Quint thought that his answer was a sensible one, and it relieved him to know that they weren't putting their trust of this sensitive issue solely into the hands of a private security contractor, a politically correct term for mercenary. The two of them emerged into the training room, and the sounds of a sparring match reached Quint's ears right away. At the far end of the room where they had gathered yesterday, the red mat was fully installed. The mirrors, weapons racks, and tables for gear had also been set up on and along the walls, empty plastic storage bins stacked in the corner. At first, Quint thought that there were not nearly as many of the bins as there had been when they'd arrived, but he assumed that some were stored inside one another. The mats were alive with two individuals going toe-to-toe. Jason was giving the match everything he had, and Kay was mercifully allowing him to do so. Both were barefoot, each sporting a set of sparring hand wraps. Jason was wearing a sleeveless t-shirt and sweatpants, while Kay seemed to be dressed in some sort of combination of modern workout cloths and loose, authentic Asian martial arts garb. Atlas and Quint approached as Jason threw punch after punch, and even a few poorly placed kicks, trying with all his might to hit his opponent with no success whatsoever. Kay either blocked each move or simply evaded them with little or no effort. "What's Jason's power again?" Quint asked as they stood at the edge of the mat. "He can shoot red energy beams from his hands," Atlas said. "Are they powerful?" "See for yourself," Atlas suggested, pointing at the wall. Quint hadn't noticed it before, but now that he looked, he saw what looked like faint black scuff marks on the concrete walls, floor, and ceiling. He realized that they were massive burn marks, which had been scrubbed until they were barely noticeable as anything other than natural decoration. "Jason made those?" Quint asked in awe. Atlas smiled with nostalgia. "He had a crush on this one girl in high school and wanted to take her to senior prom, but he got in trouble with us for sneaking out to see her, and so we grounded him for a week, which meant that he couldn't go to prom with her. He stormed off, furious, came down here to let off some steam. We felt the ground shake and I ran down here. Marianne was already here because she teleported right as I started running. Found Jason staring at the walls. They were black, and some of the concrete had started to glow red hot. The wood on the door was on fire too. He was shocked. Couldn't believe he'd done it. We were all shocked, to be honest. I've never seen him lose his cool since then. Quint chuckled. You almost sound proud of him. How can I not be? Atlas asked. He's the closest thing to a son Marianne and I have ever had. Don't look at the spot you plan to strike, they heard Kay tell Jason over the hustle of the match. He spoke to the younger man even as Jason advanced again, more ferociously this time. Focus on one spot the whole time. The sternum is preferable, the eyes if you already know what you're doing. Just be sure to stay centered so that you can see their whole body. Jason lunged forward, his movements unintentionally exaggerated as his forehead glistened with sweat. What if they've got like 4 legs and 6 arms or something crazy like that? Kay stepped aside as Jason flung himself headlong, keeping his foot in the way as he gently pushed backward with his elbow between Jason's shoulder blades. Jason toppled forward, going into a well-practiced roll that brought him to a standing position. Good, Kay murmured. Glad to see you paid attention this morning. He made a formal bow to Jason, who barely completed his own return gesture without passing out from exhaustion. They've been training nonstop since sunup, Atlas said to Quint. 5 hours. Quint's eyebrows went up. That's pretty impressive, he commented as Jason collapsed on the mat. Water. Kay turned away from him and walked toward the edge of the mat where the 2 men were standing and observing. He crossed his arms and eyed them. His gaze unnerved Quint a little, who felt like the dark brown eyes were somehow piercing him and exploring him inside and out. So, what exactly is Shatterpoint vision? He asked him. I see weaknesses in objects, people, and animals, Kay replied matter-of-factly, and it only takes once for me to hit them and bring them down. And you're here to do what? Shore up these weaknesses in us? More or less, Kay said vaguely. But I'm more interested to see what you can do. Quint stared at him, unsure of what to say. He didn't know if he trusted this man, and he had several questions for him about methods, but after seeing him toy with Jason on the mat, he had to admit he was interested in how he himself would fare against this highly skilled opponent. He had no real combat training, but his power gave him invulnerability to whatever this guy could dish out, and it made him exceptionally faster. Could he actually win? And more importantly, could he win without seriously injuring Kay? Quint Ward, right? Kay asked after Quint's pause. That's right, Quint said, offering his hand. To his surprise, Kay accepted it with a firm shake. And you're fine with your name just being a single letter from the alphabet? Perfectly, Kay said with a straight face. Overhead the doorbell rang, the sound delivered to the training room via a loudspeaker high on the wall near the door. Sounds like we have more guests, Atlas said proudly. Gentlemen, I take my leave of you. Have fun down here, but please don't break anything that can't be replaced. No chance of that, Quint said with a mischievous smile. Kay returned the expression with a wry half-grin that was more of a look that enjoyed a challenge. Okay, Ward, he said with finality, taking a few casual steps back onto the mat and beckoning with his hand. Take off those shoes and show me what you got. Jasmine had felt jealousy before, but this was one of the worst of those times in her recent memory. When she'd arrived at the Dixon house, another person had already been standing on the porch, a first-timer, just like she'd been yesterday. His name was Logan Fisher, and he had right away demonstrated a reasonable amount of control over his ability. He could fly. Jasmine couldn't understand how so many people around her had so much more control over their powers than she did over hers. Obviously, Mary Ann's explanation had made sense. Jasmine had never actively attempted to use her powers because she'd spent so long trying to hide them, or pretend they didn't exist, so naturally it would be much more difficult for her latent potential to be realized. Jasmine understood this, but it did nothing to stem the taste of envious bile in her throat when she saw the young man in front of her rise up off the ground and fly over and around the house. She had had to catch herself to stop herself from smiling or giggling when Logan had tried to come in for a flashy landing, but ended up flopping around like a dying fish due to his inability to fine-tune his connection between land and sky. She had been none too pleased when Mary Ann had taken him inside to discuss the part he would play in their group. Until then, she had never met Atlas, but the moment she first saw him, she was relieved and intimidated at the same time. His sheer size made her worry that he might crush her just by accident, or step on her or eat her or something. But as she interacted with him and saw his mannerisms, she began to realize just how much like her own father he was. He was a gentle giant, and one who appeared to have a sincere passion for what he was doing. Candace wasn't at home this time. She was out gathering more pictures of people with their special abilities for later contact. Apparently it was something of a weekly routine for her. However, Mary Ann had convinced her to come inside and relax for a bit. Jasmine did her best to make small talk, but Mary Ann could only keep a conversation about dogs, local restaurants, and the weather for so long before Jasmine shut down. She felt bad about behaving like that toward Mary Ann, who had only ever done things to make her comfortable in the few hours that they'd known each other, and so she suggested that they visit the training room. Mary Ann had been surprised by this idea, but in a happy way, and the two of them had gone down to the dugout. When they arrived, they saw a strange sight. In the center of the red mat was Kay, and in his hands was a cable attached to a loop on his belt with a carabiner. The other end of the cable was attached in similar fashion to a harness worn by Logan, who was hovering in the air. Both men were straining against the other. Logan was straining a lot more than Kay, and every few seconds Kay would give a firm yank on the cable and pull Logan closer to the ground. Mary Ann and Jasmine saw Jason, Atlas, and Quint sitting on the bottom row of benches on the other side, and as they made their way over to join them, Kay finally succeeded in pulling Logan all the way to the ground. "Man," Logan groaned, frustrated, "I'm so weak." Jasmine got a good look at the boy. He was young, maybe even as young as she was, with curly jet black hair. He was also pretty thin for a man of his age, especially with his baggy pants and oversized t-shirt. His face appeared bony and slightly pale. He was exhausted already after 10 or 15 minutes with Kay, as opposed to Jason, whom Jasmine had heard had been training for hours without giving up. Kay had a rather straightforward way of expressing his opinion. "You would be stronger if you didn't throw a pity party every time you lose," he barked. "Again." Logan rolled his eyes and a small moan escaped his throat. Kay cut him off by yanking the cable, throwing him off his feet before he'd even risen into the air. "Leave your wine at home in the cellar and pull me off the ground." Logan gave it a good faith effort for another 5 minutes, but it appeared he had been through enough for one day. Atlas came forward as the consoler, tending to Logan's battered spirit and leading him upstairs to get some food and water. Jasmine didn't know Logan's story, but she thought that Kay's treatment of him had been pretty harsh for a first-day experience. And so, when he walked right up to her and Mary Ann, she froze in place. "Which one of you lovely ladies would like to go next?" Mary Ann put her hands on Jasmine's shoulders, and Jasmine momentarily hated her guts for it. "Kay, this is Jasmine." "Yes, I remember from yesterday," Kay said, although his tone was not malicious. He stared at her for a few seconds, and then his hard gaze broke into a neutral, polite smile, and he offered his hand. "I go by Kay," he told her, "but I assume you already knew that." Jasmine simply nodded. "What's your power?" he asked. Jasmine took a moment to clear her throat, but even then she was frustrated with herself for the scratchy sound her words made as they came out. Actually, I'm not really sure," she confessed. "See, the thing is, I've never actually tried to use them on purpose." Kay crossed his arms and cocked his head. "What about on accident?" Jasmine shuffled her feet and looked down. "Well, sometimes things around me, they move on their own." Kay studied her for a few moments. "And when does this happen?" Jasmine knew that her hesitation had to be getting on Kay's nerves. "Well, usually it happens when I'm asleep, or when I'm really relaxed, or when I'm trying really hard to focus on something." "Give me an example," he said. Jasmine felt like she was at the doctor's office. "Well, the first time it happened was when I was 12, and I was trying to get this ball out of a tree in my neighbor's yard, but I wasn't supposed to go over the fence. The ball ended up coming out of the tree on its own and rolling back toward me, and I ran away screaming and telling my mom that the ball was trying to chase me. It was so embarrassing." Kay stood there, staring at her once more, this time for a few seconds longer, and one of his hands was scratching the goatee on his chin. He narrowed his eyes, then turned his head toward Marianne. "I'm thinking maybe telekinesis?" Marianne nodded. "I was thinking that too." Kay nodded back, then turned back to Jasmine. "How about a demonstration?" Jasmine's heart nearly stopped. "What? Me? Right now?" "Yes, you. Right now," Kay told her, the pleasantness beginning to rapidly drain out of his voice. Jasmine felt herself beginning to panic. I can't. I have to be relaxed." "You can do it," Kay said, more as a command than an encouragement. "I can't with all these people watching me." "You're not getting undressed. You're using your mind to move things," Kay retorted. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea for her right now," Quinn spoke up, much to Jasmine's relief. Her emancipation was too good to be true, however. "No excuses," Kay said. "Don't you think you're being a little hard on her, like you were with that Logan kid?" Quint insisted. Kay turned toward him, his face darkening and his voice taking on a sharp sensation. "No, I don't. We need to learn how to control these powers, or else we can all cause some serious damage to the things and people around us. It's not an option, it's an obligation. This is necessary for us, just like blood sugar testing is necessary for people with diabetes." "These are gifts, Kay," Marianne chided sternly. "This isn't a disease that needs to be treated or cured." "It's a responsibility," Kay insisted. "Whatever you want to call it, I don't care, but we owe it to the people who don't have any defense against us to make darn sure we don't hurt them by accident. It's just like martial arts training. There, I'll use that analogy since my blood sugar one almost made you faint. And in real martial arts training, the first thing you learn is discipline. You learn character, you learn control, and you learn all of that before you learn how to throw a single punch or kick. Because if you have the knowledge or capability to damage another human being, you are responsible to control it. This is no different, except that the stakes are higher than any type of martial art." There was silence from the others, and Jasmine had to admit that she'd never thought of it that way before. She'd been so scared about what revealing her abilities could do to her that she'd never honestly given thought as to what they might do to others, or the damage she could do. Kay's words rung true with her as she remembered the hole in her dorm ceiling. Jason had said she had caused it, but she had no idea how she'd done that. It added legitimacy to Kay's insistence, because if she didn't even understand how her powers worked, there was a good chance that they could go out of control and easily cause some serious destruction. "Okay," she murmured, breaking the silence. "I'll try." She began to take in a deep breath, but Kay stopped her. "No, wait," he said, drawing curious looks from the others. "Actually follow me. I have another idea that might work better." Jasmine hadn't even noticed the nearly invisible door in the wall at the end of the arena. It was set right in the center of the wall, between the two sets of bleachers on either side. Unlike the other two doors on either side of the room up at the top, this door was made with an aluminum frame with concrete poured into thin but sturdy sheets to cover both sides and camouflage the door against the wall. Apparently Marianne wasn't aware that Atlas had given Kay access to the secret room either, but Kay assured her that he and Atlas had arrived at a suitable arrangement. The room was about the size of one of the refurbished guest rooms in the house, longer than it was wide, and it was dimly lit by a bulb from an old ceiling fan that didn't work. Kay had added more lights to the side walls to make the room brighter, and that helped banish some of the underground room's dingy appearance. There was a bed stuck into the far corner. Actually, it was more of a cot that looked practically brand new. On the entire left wall, opposite the door, was a line of old shelves hanging above one long set of workbenches built into the wall. Some of them had been repaired, and some of them were still in the process of being repaired. Several of the plastic storage bins that Kay had brought with him were in here. One or two of them was open, the lids stored underneath, and some of the sparring equipment like the chest pads, gloves, and foot protectors was sitting there waiting to be used. One or two others had yet to be opened. The shelves that had been fully repaired were now home to methodically organized groups of specific weapons, gadgets, and other things that Jasmine couldn't ever imagine using. She would have taken longer to look around, but Kay brought her inside and shut the door immediately, almost hitting Jason in the face. "Hey! No distractions!" Kay yelled back, and for once Jasmine was slightly grateful. She would have been eternally self-conscious if she'd had to do whatever it was she was about to do in front of Jason. However, that didn't make her any more comfortable around this strange man in this strange room. "Pull that cot over to the middle of the room," Kay told her. Jasmine did as she was told. "What are you going to do?" she forced herself to ask, even in spite of the reaction she'd feared she'd get from Kay. "My power, Shatterpoint Vision, lets me see weak points, stress points, shatter points," Jasmine quipped sarcastically without thinking. She realized what she'd done and looked at Kay in terror, expecting to be punched in the face and told to shut up. Instead, she saw him crack a tiny, tiny smile. It tugged up on the corner of his mouth just enough to be visible. "Yes, shatter points," he repeated wryly. He gestured to the cot. "Lie down on your back." Jasmine took her position on the cot carefully as Kay turned toward one of the shelves and took down a small white wooden box with some sort of Asian calligraphy on the side. "I've honed my ability to the point where I can see every single pressure point on the human body," Kay continued as he opened the box. He set it on one of the work tables beside the cot and opened it, revealing a meticulously arranged set of needles. "And that makes me an excellent acupuncturist," he said, pulling several of the needles out of the box. Jasmine swallowed. "I've never had acupuncture before," she said, noticing a quiver in her voice. "That's all right," Kay said casually. "Just close your eyes and relax. Don't open them at all right?" Jasmine closed her eyes. All right. Promise?" "Yeah, promise." "All right, then. Just relax and think about something nice. Think about a nice memory." "Huh, I don't have very many of those." Kay chuckled. "No, Jasmine, I don't have very many of those. You've got plenty. When was the last time you laughed? I mean, really laughed?" Jasmine thought of the first night in the Heford Community College dorm with Nate and Jenny. It brought a smile to her face just thinking about it. "There you go," Kay said. "See, I told you so." "Yeah." "Now, keep your eyes closed and tell me. Do you feel anything?" No. Are you going to start, or are we just going to sit here all night?" "No, I started right when you closed your eyes. You have about 15 needles sticking out of you right now." "Seriously?" "Yep." "Weird. I feel really sleepy." "No, that's probably just because you're an insomniac, but the acupuncture is definitely helping you relax." "That's nice." "Now, Jasmine, tell me, what do you remember about this room when you first walked in?" Let's see. Well, there was a cot, which I'm lying on now. There was a fan on the ceiling, and it wasn't turning. There were shelves, and some of them work and some of them don't. And do you remember how you would fix those shelves?" Kay asked. His voice came from somewhere lower, as though he was kneeling next to her on the floor. "What? No, I didn't pay attention to that." "Sorry. Continue." "Okay, so the cot, the shelves, and on the shelves there were lots of gadgets and weapons and stuff, and a box of acupuncture needles, and I guess 15 of those needles are sticking out of me right now." "What sort of gadgets or weapons do you remember?" At least 2 swords, and this weird hook gun thing, and a few others, but I don't remember all the details." "That's fine." "And then the bins with the fighting gear in them. Those are in the other corner." "All right, good." "Oh, and obviously the door." Jasmine stopped as she heard that same door slide open again. There was a pause, and then a timid voice that belonged to an abashed and inquiring Jason. Should I come in now?" Kay's tone seemed to suggest that he already knew the answer to the question he was asking. "Didn't you open the door?" "No," Jason said carefully. "Neither did I." Jasmine was confused. "What are you talking about? Is everything okay?" "It sure is," Kay concluded. "Now, Jasmine, what I want you to do is open your eyes, but not before I tell you, all right?" "Okay." "First, let me describe what's going on so that you don't panic when you see it. Remember everything that you mentioned about this room just now. Every single thing you mentioned is hovering in the air right now. You focused on it when you remembered it, and so now it's floating around the room." Jasmine didn't know what to say. Her mouth struggled to form words, but no sound came out at first. It was almost exactly the same as her dream last week in her dorm room. She felt her pulse quickening. So, what should I do? Kay's voice was calm and soothing, almost like a hypnotist. Well, first, you must keep calm. As long as you realize that everything is okay and that nothing bad is going to happen, you'll be fine. But what if... No! Kay barked suddenly, cutting a clean slash through Jasmine's anxiety-filled imagination. She felt his voice get closer, the intensity in his words chilling her blood as he spoke very slowly, each word the pointed end of an arrow piercing her worries. If you ever want to control your power, you can never worry about what might be. You can only ever focus on what is, no matter what. Don't panic. Jasmine took a deep breath, then another, feeling her pulse slow every time the air came in and went out. Are you ready? Jasmine forced herself to relax. Nothing bad will happen. I'll be fine. Focus on what is. She nodded. I'm ready. Open your eyes and sit up very slowly. Jasmine opened her eyes. The first thing she noticed was that there were 3 needles hovering in front of her face, just within arm's length. She worried that they might try to stab her in the eyes if she sat up, but she forced that thought out of the way too. She slowly rose on the cot and found that she was much higher than she expected. Her cot was levitating gently in the air, at eye level with Kay, who was standing right next to her. She also noticed that all the needles from her body had removed themselves and were slowly rotating in a circle around her as though going through some invisible choreographed dance routine. The box of acupuncture needles was floating quietly beside her shoulder, like a pet parrot on the shoulder of a pirate, and the needles that had still been in the box had been added to the ones circling around her. The 2 swords from the rack on the wall were floating around at the other end of the room, along with that strange hook gun contraption and the sparring gear from the bins she'd brought up earlier. She remembered that she'd also mentioned the fan, and when she looked up and saw it, she noticed that it was steadily rotating, even though there was no way it should actually be working. Lastly, she remembered talking about the door. Right before... I opened the door! With my mind! She exclaimed, her pulse starting to race again. She noticed that as she became more excited, the circle of needles and the fan also began to spin faster. She realized this right as she did it and started to concentrate harder. Within moments, the spinning slowed to a crawl. Jasmine just then noticed everyone in the room. Jason, Marianne, Quint, and Atlas were all there, their mouths hanging open, their eyes wide as saucers. That's incredible, Quint said in quiet awe. That is amazing, Marianne exclaimed. Wow, was all Atlas could say. Jason was speechless. Jasmine looked at everything and realized just then that she really could learn to do this. That was the moment when her life entered its next chapter, and she had never looked forward to changing so much. She looked at Kay, who had his own look of amazement, but it was far more subdued than the others. Wow, he said. I've never seen anything like it. Jasmine smiled. Thanks, she said. Then she realized she might have a bit of an issue. She smiled sheepishly and looked around at the floor beneath her. How do I get down?